be seated. So if you have your Bibles and want to turn to Genesis 25, it's going to be really helpful to have that text in front of you. You can grab one of the Bibles in the pew in front of you. It's probably the KJV, but I read from the ESV, so if you have your phones and you got the ESV app, that could even be helpful to go to Genesis 25. We're going to take 18 verses there. What's significant about the fact that we've arrived to Genesis 25 is that we are at the halfway point in the book of Genesis. So if you've been with us during this time, it's next week will have been one entire year in the book of Genesis. And so we're halfway done. Now, the latter half, I feel like, is going to go faster than the front half because you got so much stuff to cover, especially in those first few chapters when you get going in Genesis. But I think we're going to pick up the pace as we go along and finish the second half quicker than it took us to get through the first half. But a lot's happened in the Bible so far, right? We're 25 chapters deep. We're several people deep into the Bible. That's one way to think of it. And we've learned so much about how this gospel of hope has been woven through all of these people throughout this timeline. I mean, it all started with Adam and Eve in the garden. We saw the fall of man in Adam and Eve whenever the serpent deceived Eve and sin entered the world. And then we see where God pronounced a judgment upon Adam and Eve and upon the serpent. And in particular, he said that the offspring of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. We remember that pronouncement of judgment that God pronounces upon the serpent. One day, the offspring of the woman is going to crush your head. That was the first glimpse of the gospel in the Bible. That was the first bit of hope that people got to live with after the fall of man, that God was going to redeem. God was going to rescue this dire situation of the fall of mankind. Now, Eve, we know when she had Cain, she was hoping that would be the offspring. Well, it wasn't. Didn't work out with Cain. But from that point, we've seen from person to person all of these names that we've studied throughout these first 25 chapters. There's a mix of people. Some people cling to this hope that they have in God, and then other people's reject that hope in God and reject who God is. And we got a mix of people since the fall of man, and it's been that way every day since, up till now. So the last 13 chapters that we've been studying, though, the Bible's spotlight has been on one man. It's been on Abraham, and we've been studying his life, how he was called out of paganism, and he lived with a special hope as well, also in an offspring. And we've been studying his life up to the point of Isaac, and he lived with that promise always on his mind, that he had this hope in this offspring that would come. And there's been all of these ups and downs in his imperfect life, but Abraham believed God in the hope of this offspring, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And that's the big takeaway from his life. But it's really studying Abraham's life in the Bible that helps us to see this thread of hope that's woven throughout Scripture. It comes in the sharper focus whenever we look at the life of Abraham. He's just one name on the list of many that we're going to continue to study through this book, but his life is coming to an end here today. So in some ways, it feels like I'm preaching his funeral today, which is kind of weird. I know you didn't, no one gets excited to go to a funeral, right? But I get so emotionally attached to people in the Bible whenever I deep dive on their lives. And when it comes to Abraham, I've been deep diving on every detail of his life since like March. And so I feel like I know him. I feel like, I like to imagine what's going through his mind in these different situations in life. And I get emotionally attached. And we've come to the end of his life here today. And I'm like, oh man, I'm going to miss studying Abraham. So I feel like I'm preaching his funeral. We're all going to say goodbye to Abraham in the book of Genesis. Part of me is like, oh, let's all reminisce about what we've studied about Abraham. What's your favorite story about Abraham? What was your favorite moment? It'd be fun to hear which one of these moments impacted you the most. Which one would you go to first? That's typically what you do at a funeral, right? You share all these different thoughts, and where would you go to in the life of Abraham? Would you go to where he's charging in battle, saving Lot, beating these kings and rescuing people from slavery? Or you probably wouldn't mention him giving his wife away to these different kings and stuff like that. But we're gonna lay him to rest today in chapter 25. And it's actually a really important part of Genesis because we're going to see the significance of him passing that torch on. And it really, just like any other funeral, it's an opportunity for you and I to think about life in light of death. Maybe that's the challenge today. As you study the death of Abraham, I want you to think about how you live in light of death. Do you live in light of death? There's a passage out of Ecclesiastes that I share at every funeral that I preach. And I just shared it a couple weeks ago at a funeral that I preached, and I want to read it to you because it talks about the value that we should place on funerals and living in light of death. This comes from Ecclesiastes. Only something like this would come out of Ecclesiastes, one of the weirdest philosophical books ever written. But when you look at chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes, you don't have to turn there, I'll read it to you. The preacher says this in chapter 7, starting at verse 2. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. That's a weird passage. Mirth, it would be like a party or something like that, but it's a weird passage, right? I mean, because all of us would rather go to a party than a funeral. So why is there wisdom in going to the funeral over the party? All of us would rather laugh than we would cry. So why is the heart of the wise cry or value crying more than they value laughter? Well, the reason is because death, we're confronted with death. And if you want to be wise, if you want to live with wisdom, you need to think about how you live in light of your impending death. You're going to die. So what's the point of your life? That's kind of the point in Ecclesiastes. I don't want to get too deep into Ecclesiastes. I'll get lost because I love it. But that's what the preacher wants you to think about in that book. What's the point of life knowing when you know that you're going to die? Well, we're going to look at Abraham's life and his death, and I think it's going to give us an opportunity to reflect in that way. What was the point of his life? Well, we're going to see Abraham in the first couple of verses of chapter 25. He's going to execute his will. It reads like a will because he's executing his will just before he dies. He wants to set his family up to make sure that the promises of God live on and carry on. There's a legacy of faith there. And so he situates things. He organizes things to ensure that this happens. And so I guess if his life teaches us anything in chapter 25, it's this, that your life's going to end, but the promises of God are going to go on. So how are you going to live right now to ensure that you are passing the torch well? How are you living in such a way right now in your life that's going to matter to people of faith down the road? Let's look here, 25. I'm going to take the first 6 verses. Abraham took another wife. Oh man, that's not what we expected to read, right? Let me go ahead and start that over. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The son of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of the concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So you're going to hear me fumble over some names today. We don't know how these names are pronounced, so I'm just going to try to say them with confidence. But isn't it interesting? So I set this up to talk about his funeral. The first thing we see is that he gets remarried. And that's kind of shocking, right? I mean, just when you think he's done, Abraham gets like a second wind right before he dies. Like out of nowhere, he's marrying another lady. Like, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but I have an uncle, a great uncle in his 90s, who I just met he just got remarried. And I just met his new wife at a family gathering this past summer. He found some young chick in her late 80s at Sunday school. I mean, he's picking up chicks the old-fashioned way at church, at Sunday school, and got married after being widowed. And it's just like, all right, go Uncle Lowell. Like, get busy living or get busy dying, as they say, right? Oh, man. Well, here's Abraham. He's well over 100 years old, and he marries Keturah and has 6 more kids. Wow. Did you notice something, though, in those first 6 verses? Here's the thing when you get to studying Keturah. In verse 1, she's called his wife. And in verse 6, it references the sons of the concubines, their kids. And so, is she his wife or is she a concubine? What's going on with Keturah? What's happening here? So there's a couple of different, scholars debate this stuff, so we don't really know for sure. But option one, if you want to think of it this way, option one, some scholars are going to say that Keturah was a concubine in Abraham's life during Sarah's lifetime. We know that Sarah just passed away here recently, and that Keturah was there all along, just not mentioned. And so in this scenario, Abraham had 2 wives, Sarah and Hagar, and we know the whole Hagar situation, and Hagar was sent away, but he had Keturah by his side the whole time, and in Sarah's death, she then got promoted to his wife. And so that makes us a little uncomfortable. Now, one thing I love about the Bible, it tells us all the good, all the bad, all the ugly. It doesn't hide the sin of the saints in Scripture, right? So, but this one makes me uncomfortable. I don't like to think of Abraham with these concubines and things, but he's not perfect, and the Bible never said he was perfect. It said just the opposite. We get to see all of his warts and everything. But that theory about Keturah doesn't really flow with the text. The fact that she's not mentioned until now, it kind of makes me lean towards option number 2, and that's that Sarah died, Abraham was widowed. We know Hagar's already long gone, and so he remarries and marries Keturah, and so she doesn't come into the picture until after Sarah's death. And so then he lived another 38 years, had 6 more kids. But then why is the word concubines used then in verse 6? You still have to explain that word, and it's complicated. It's really complicated for us to understand all of these scenarios with perfection because we have our cultural lens. We got our cultural goggles on, and we know how things are supposed to be. And so when we, according to how our culture lives and exists, and so when we look at situations like this with those goggles on, sometimes we miss some of the things that are happening in their culture and the expectations that were there. So there's a language barrier between us and Abraham, but there's also a cultural barrier. So we gotta carefully look through the details here. And so if you study their culture and their day and age, the word concubine and who was called a concubine, it's complicated. So whenever you would go and find a wife, we've seen this happen several times in the book of Genesis already, you would oftentimes pay a bride price for your wife. And so Abraham likely did this with Sarah, and Sarah was his primary wife. She was the OG when it comes to the wives of Abraham. But you notice he didn't pay that bride price with Hagar. He didn't pay that bride price with Keturah because they were already servants in his household. And so Hagar was promoted. That was Sarah's idea in Abraham's defense. She was promoted to wife status, but she would have been seen as a secondary wife. And we see as that story unfolded, Sarah and Abraham eventually started speaking about Hagar in a way that's really clear that she is definitely seen as a secondary wife. And it's likely that she could have been referred to, even though she's not, referred to as a concubine because she has that secondary wife status. So it's the same with Keturah. She was already within the household. He would not have paid a bride price for her. So he's widowed, and she's promoted to wife status. She We have no reason to believe there was any sort of sexual relationship or concubine relationship before that time. But since she was promoted to wife status, she still wasn't Sarah. She wasn't the primary wife. And so she would have had that secondary wife status and could have been referred to as a concubine in that scenario. Why is this relevant? Why am I taking time to explain this? Because it's relevant to the inheritance that we're about ready to see. So in our culture, in our day and age, when somebody dies, we divvy up their stuff equally, right? That's what's socially acceptable. But that wasn't the case back in the day in this culture. So the firstborn was who inherited everything, and it was the firstborn of the primary wife. And so that is really relevant to the scenario we're reading here, because otherwise we're gonna think really badly of how this unfolds. So verse 6 says that Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, because that's what was culturally acceptable. He was the only son of the promise, yes, but he was the only son of Abraham's primary wife, Sarah, who was never at any point a servant in his household like Hagar. So her son Ishmael didn't have any legal right. Only Sarah's son would have that legal right because she was the original primary wife of Abraham. Now, I want to look at one little side note, one little rabbit trail. I promise I won't do many rabbit trails today, but did you notice whenever we're reading the list of names of Keturah's children, that Midian, we're told more about Midian and his descendants. We're told that he has 5 sons. And why does chapter 25, it mentions the kids of Keturah. Why do we get more information about Midian? Well, for those of you who are really paying attention in your Sunday school class and you're paying attention to when we get to Joseph, he's sold into slavery. It's the Midianites who actually purchase Joseph when he's in slavery. So maybe that's why we get a little bit more information about Midian in verse 4. But I think it's because we got to remember who's writing the book of Genesis. This is Moses who wrote the book of Genesis. Moses, we know his story. And whenever he killed that Egyptian soldier for beating that Jewish slave, he then fled into the wilderness. Who does he go to live with when he's in the wilderness? He lives with the Midianites. He takes a wife for himself amongst the Midianites, Zipporah. And so she is a descendant of Midian. And so I think the reason that we get this additional information about Midian is because Moses is penning this and he's taking a moment to connect his family line to Abraham. He's saying, hey, not only am I a descendant of Abraham, but Zipporah, my wife, who's a Midianite, her family you can connect back to Abraham too, through Keturah. It's just an interesting fact. I mean, it's with the Midianites that Moses has this experience with God in the burning bush. I mean, it's just interesting to think. That's just one little rabbit trail I couldn't help but take in my sermon. But back to Abraham. He's died, and so there wouldn't be any confusion about executing his will. He does it himself. He's going to sort all of this out. For those of you who have, heard those horror stories, or maybe you've experienced a horror story like this. Someone in your family dies, or you know someone who died, and then their family all starts to squabble over who gets what. How many scenarios? I just had a conversation this weekend about how these things happen. They're pretty common. And so for those of you who have lived through a nightmare like that, or you've heard a horror story like that where people are fighting over who gets what, you can actually appreciate what Abraham's doing right here. Hey, I want to sort all this out before I die. You get this, you get that, this is where this goes. So there's no confusion. I'm going to give everybody what's theirs right now before I die. And so when we read this and see who gets what, Isaac gets everything, everybody else just gets gifts. That's not fair. Well, that's not fair in our culture. But Abraham, is following the cultural customs of his day, in addition to, he's living faithfully to the promises God made to him, that Isaac was the son of the promise. Isaac and his descendants are in the covenant line between Abraham and God, that covenant promise. And so the fact that he gives anything to these other kids through Keturah, actually, if you were some of the first people reading Genesis, you would have seen that Abraham gave gifts to his other sons. You'd be like, wow. He's actually incredibly generous that he's giving all of these other things to his other children. He didn't have to do that. He gave them each, he goes the extra mile here in giving them an inheritance, giving them these gifts, and then he sends them to the east country. Well, again, that sounds harsh, but he's actually providing for them so they can start a new life. He's not just sending them packing. This would have been a normal practice in that time. And so we may see that Isaac gets everything and think, oh man, this is favoritism. But that's not how they would have seen that. This would have all been completely normal to them. Probably the closest thing that we can have in our culture, in our day and age to this, you might think of like a family farm that's been in the family for generations and generations. And that farmer, he has, say 3 sons. And 2 of those sons, they go to the big city and live out their careers. But one son, he's the farmer. Who gets the farm? Well, the farmer gets the farm, right? And the other siblings aren't going to be mad about it because, like, they'll see that more like his birthright. Like, hey, we want that farm to stay in the family. So yeah, they're going to be okay with him getting that part of the inheritance. That's kind of the closest thing. That's not a one-for-one there, but at the end of Abraham's life, he's taking these steps ultimately to preserve the covenant in his family line. It's a great time for you and I to reflect. How are you living in light of death? How are you living? Like, we live with the promises of God too. They mean something to us too. But are you living in such a way that you are setting things up to leave that legacy of faith in your family? Let's continue here in 7 through 11. Abraham's going to die. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zahor, the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There, Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Laharoi. Well, you might remember back in Genesis 15, God cuts a covenant with Abraham, and he made a promise to Abraham as Abraham fell into that deep sleep. And he says to Abraham, I'll just read to you a verse from chapter 15. He says to Abraham, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. 10 chapters later, we're seeing Abraham buried at a good old age. God's promises always come true. And as we read through Genesis, we see example after example of that happening. He is an old man full of years. I deep dived on that phrase, full of years. What exactly did that mean? Did it just mean he had a lot of days in his life? Well, he certainly did have a lot of days in his life. But that phrase, full of years, really would be better translated, even though it sounds more awkward. It would be better translated as satisfied of days. He died with a fulfillment, a fulfilled heart. He died happy. Doesn't everybody want to die happy in here? Abraham's the guy who died happy. Does that mean his life was perfect? No. Does that mean everything went the way he hoped it would? No. He had problems, he had sin, but he died happy. Why? Because he ended up right where God said he would end up. He sorted out everything the way that would honor God. And this promise, this legacy of faith was going to continue through the life of Isaac. And so he lived to be 175 years old, and the dude was ready. He died happy. I want to die happy like that. The other phrase that jumped out at me is verse 8 as well. It said that he was gathered to his people. This is a really interesting phrase to deep dive on in the text. After he died, but before he was buried, it said he was gathered to his people. What does this mean? Well, we're going to see that phrase pop up several more times in Genesis, and you'll see it in other places in the Bible too. Ishmael, in the next paragraph, when he dies, but before he's buried, he's going to be gathered to his people. Later, we'll see Isaac, when he dies, he was gathered to his people. Then Jacob, whenever he dies, it said that he was gathered to his people. But also when you get to guys like Aaron and Moses, when they die, it said that they were gathered to their people. What does it mean to be gathered to your people? It just like gathering up the bones in a bucket and taking them to the family? Like that's not really how it's traditionally been interpreted. especially in the Jewish tradition, when they see this gathered to his people, they see this as an idiom that is referring to the afterlife, that when you die, you are gathered to your people. That is, you are gathered along with all of the other faithful people. You are gathered together with them. This is not all that there is. There is life after death. And so we see this even in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus was actually, in Matthew 22, he was debating with the Sadducees, and he was debating about the resurrection. He was debating about life after death. And the Sadducees, they weren't so much on the life after death thing, which is kind of unique. And the way that you can remember that is because that's why they were sad, you see. They're the Sadducees. It's just a little, I don't know, it's a way to remember it. But they were sad. So whenever he's debating them about the resurrection, he actually mentions Abraham. He quotes the Old Testament. He says, "And as for the resurrection of the dead," this is Jesus talking, "have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living." As in, he didn't say he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God of. As in presently, he is still the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Like they're still around. They didn't go away. It's because they were gathered up to the faithful saints, and they are together with God. And so when Abraham died, he was gathered up with the faithful before him, people like Adam and Eve, and Abel, and Enoch, and Noah. So here's one more rabbit trail. I'm sorry, I said I wasn't going to do another one, and then I do have another one in my notes. So what about Ishmael? You know, in the next paragraph, we're going to read it here in just a moment. There is the phrase, he was gathered to his people, in reference to Ishmael. So was Ishmael gathered with the faithful? Did he get in or not? That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. He was loved by Abraham. He was circumcised by Abraham. Whew. But he wasn't a son of the promise. So when he died, was he gathered with the faithful? That is above my pay grade. I'm gonna opt out of answering that one with any confidence, but it is interesting to see how people have interpreted this throughout church history and how they see that. A lot of people make a distinction here between Abraham being gathered up with the faithful, and Ishmael being gathered up with the unfaithful. Of course, we read we'll see it in the next paragraph too. When you study about Ishmael's life, we know he was going to be a wild donkey of a man. We remember that description of Ishmael. But there's a lot of hostility between Ishmael and a lot of the people groups that he lived around, and a lot of conflict and things like that, if that makes you feel better. But was he gathered up to the unfaithful? Everybody's getting gathered up one way or another. You're going to be gathered up to the faithful, or you're going to be gathered up to the unfaithful? Really, that's the question you need the answer to the most, more so than Ishmael. What about you? When you die, and you will, and you're going to be gathered up, what grouping of people are you going to be gathered up with, and why do you believe that? There's the answers that you really need to think about. If you think you're going to be gathered up with the faithful, why? Tell me why. If you think you're going to be gathered up with the unfaithful, tell me why. Could you answer those things? I think that's ultimately what this text wants us to contemplate. You know, in verse 11, after Abraham is buried with Sarah, we get a key pivot point in the book of Genesis. It says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. So this special blessing that's been on Abraham's life this entire time, he's been a friend of God, that is now being transferred in a special way to Isaac. Abraham's faith, it outlived him, and I hope that it outlives all of us too, right? It's going to. I mean, this faith that exists, it's going to, the gospel, the message of the gospel, it's going to go on. You know, there's tons of pastors that have preached today, and pastors come and go. There's a lot of churches full of people today. Churches come and go. But the gospel message is going to continue. This thread of hope is going to continue to weave through the people of God. Are you participating in that story of the faithful? We know that ultimately, that depends on God, right? God is doing that work, but are you participating in that work? Are you living right now in such a way that you're part of that? I think that's what the text wants us to contemplate today. But everything in here teaches us that when God makes a promise, he's going to follow through on that promise. He followed through on his promise to Abraham. He even followed through on his promises to Isaac. God follows through on his promises to the covenant line, but he also follows through on his promises to those who are outside of that covenant line, such as Ishmael. You remember back in Genesis 17, God promises to take care of Ishmael. He promises that Ishmael is going to be fruitful, and he's going to be his descendants are going to be nations as well. Well, in 12 through 18, God's going to follow through on his promise. Look at 12 through 18. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in order from their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tamah, Jetur, Nephish, and Kedama. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names. By their villages and their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. Again, there's some of that conflict that's mentioned there. But Ishmael, he went on to have 12 sons. Isn't that interesting? It kind of mirrors the 12 tribes of Israel. They're not the main storyline, but the point is this: God made promises about Ishmael too, and God followed through on all of those promises. Even his life proves that God follows through. So these tribes of Ishmael that are his descendants, they're going to end up being problematic for the people of God. There's going to be these battles and conflicts that take place, and they're descendants from Ishmael. But the big takeaway in Abraham's death, what do we take away from this? How can I preach his funeral and do it justice today? What would I write about Abraham? That's the ultimate takeaway of his life. We know all the good and bad and the ugly. You know, it's interesting. I know this church family. I'm going to preach some of your funerals too, most likely. That's probably the way this is going to go down. I hope someone in here preaches my funeral someday. That'd be kind of cool. But it's likely I'm going to preach one of your funerals. And so what can be said about you? What do you want me to say? What will I say at your funeral if I get to preach it? I won't do you bad. I won't mention the bad stuff. In the same way, I won't mention the bad stuff in Abraham's life, right? Even though I know a lot of the dirt in this room too. I won't mention all that stuff. What ultimately matters, though? That's the big question. When you're preaching someone's funeral, you want to talk about their life and what ultimately mattered about their life. What can I say about Abraham? What ultimately mattered about his life? Was it all of his wealth? No. He just divided that up. Everybody, he worked for all that wealth his whole life, and then he gave it away to people that didn't work for it their whole life. I mean, same thing's going to happen to you and me. Or, it can't be his wealth. Was it his victory in battle? It was an impressive win back when he rescued Lot, but that was like a footnote in the story of Abraham, and we don't even know what happened to Lot. He's just gone. He's just gone. So what matters? What about Abraham matters? Well, it said he passed on his faith. He died happy as a result of it. That's all that matters at the end of the day, at the end of your life. Will there be a pivot where the legacy of faith carries on in your family line? Abraham passed everything on to Isaac, not just his estate, but his place in the covenant. That's what matters. His part in the promises of God. He passed that on to Isaac. And so, when all of this time we've studied Abraham's life, it wasn't about God being a part of what Abraham was doing. It was about Abraham being a part of the bigger story of what God was doing. And it's the same thing with you and I. A lot of times we just try to fit God into our lives, and we want to, sprinkle in some God in our life that he can be a part of what we're doing. But that's not how a believer is supposed to think. That's not how a Christian is supposed to think. We want to live our lives in such a way that we can participate in his bigger story and what God is doing in the history of redemption. We want to be a part of what he's doing. We want to participate in that. And we want to pass that participation on to our family after we die, that we can leave a legacy of faith. So will that be the story that I get to tell at your funeral? Will that be what I get to say? Will I get to say that so-and-so died satisfied of days? And let me tell you why. It's because they were a part of what God was doing in the world. That's what I can't say that at every single funeral that I do, because I would be lying if I said that every single time. But I hope that I can say that about each and every one of you that I get to preach your funeral, that you died happy because you were a part of what God's doing in the world. That's what defines us. That's what makes our lives matter in the grand scheme of things, that we're gathered up with the faithful. All right, let's pray. Lord, again, I'm so grateful to study the book of Genesis with these people and get to contemplate how we live our lives right now in light of death. Death it levels the playing field, as we learn in the book of Ecclesiastes. It doesn't matter how accomplished we are. It doesn't matter how much wealth we've gained. It doesn't matter, all these things that we put so much stock in, Lord, they don't matter. At the end of the day, what matters about us is if we're part of what you are doing in this world to redeem your people. Help us to live in light of that, because that's what matters the most. Are we passing on? Are we living in such a way now that we are intentionally passing on this legacy of faith to our children? Lord, maybe we be faithful in that and steward this time that we have with them well. Lord, it's in your name that we ask these things. Jesus, amen.